Hello, everybody. I'm Brian Bolwell, and I'm chairman of the Taussig Cancer Institute at the Cleveland Clinic. And I'm happy to be talking with Dave Fredrickson today for our Fireside chat. Dave works with AstraZeneca, one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies devoted to cancer drugs and cancer therapeutics. In fact, he leads that effort. So welcome, Dave, and could you tell us a bit about yourself?
Well, Dr. Bolwell, thank you very much for having me here at the Fireside Chat. It's truly a pleasure to be with Cleveland Clinic, and AstraZeneca has very much been a part of past years. And while this year is a little different in a virtual format, we're pleased to be able to join you for some really relevant discussions that I know we're about to have. As you highlight in the introduction, I'm the Executive Vice President of our Oncology efforts at AstraZeneca. I am part of the senior executive team, and I report into the CEO, Pascal Soriot, and my focus is on leading all of our both strategic and in-market work that we do to make sure that we are advancing therapies for the treatment of cancer patients, but also very much focused on real-world delivery of those medicines to improve outcomes post-clinical trials. So happy to be here today.
So again, thank you very much and welcome. Top of mind for everybody, Dave, is the impact that COVID has had on pretty much every industry. How has that affected AstraZeneca? Has that changed anything that you guys are doing with respect to drug development and oncology? How are you guys managing this?
Well, I think that perhaps as an important starting point on this, maybe just start a little bit with some of the context. I mean, I think prior to the pandemic, we were all heartened by various reports, whether it was from the American Cancer Society or other publications that have happened, that we saw that death rates in cancer had been leveling off, or in some cases were decreasing, as patients were increasingly taking a more active role in their own care. And we saw that the death rate from cancer declined by 29% from 1991 to 2017 in the US alone. And that included a 2.2% drop from 2016 to 2017. It was the largest ever drop recorded. And the story behind these numbers really does speak to the incredible advancements that we've been making in finding the right targets and understanding genetic biomarkers, advancements in clinical endpoints, and the work that we were doing. Unfortunately, as the world went into lockdown, which you're alluding to, I think a lot of that progress has been put to the test. And I think that the fear of contracting COVID-19 at hospitals and at clinics has overwhelmed some. And it's become a deterrent for some patients to seek testing or to seek the medical attention for symptoms when they've appeared. And in fact, patients who've been diagnosed with cancer, some have even discontinued treatment because of their fear of contracting COVID-19 at treatment centers. So I think that the imperative is clear here, that we do not want progress that's been made in cancer treatment to stall. We don't want to give back the advancements that we've been making. So I think that within that context, we've adapted at AstraZeneca. We've moved quickly to launch a range of strategies to try to mitigate the impact of COVID-19. I think that they probably fall into three buckets. The first bucket is outreach, that we know has been absolutely essential to encourage patients to not allow themselves to become passive in the way in which they're approaching their care, but to reinvigorate and to become active. And maybe later on, I can tell you more about some of the specific things we're doing there. The second bucket is really making sure that in the real world, we're addressing things that patients are concerned about. How can they actually better leverage telemedicine? How can we have home services that allow for remote monitoring, remote testing, and various ways to leverage technology and data in order to be able to allow as much care as possible to happen at high quality outside of hospital settings across the globe. And then I think thirdly, we've made a number of evolutions in our development program in leveraging technology, and really, a very small portion of our clinical trials in oncology have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think that's because we've removed the need in a number of instances for patients to travel to hospitals on things that they didn't need to travel to hospitals on. And so I think these changes have allowed us to gather data more effectively and efficiently while removing the strain on the hospitals. And these are the three major buckets we've honed in on.
Yeah, I think they're all really important points. So for those of you in the audience who want some context about what happened here at the clinic, we were open throughout the initial parts of the pandemic and obviously remain open. Our volumes dropped in April, but our new patient volumes actually dropped the most in May. We were seeing about 40% fewer new patients than we'd seen the year before, which speaks to your point, Dave, of clearly cancer hadn't stopped. So there was a reticence for people to come and have symptoms addressed, probably a decrease in screening as well. But one of the points, and we're actually almost back up to normal. We're about 92, 93% where we'd like to be, which is better than much of the rest of the United States. So we're pleased about that. But I think one very important thing is that our participation in clinical trials actually is better this year than last year, surprisingly. And I think one of the reasons is for the reason you just alluded to, Dave, is the fact that a lot of the requirements for clinical trials really sometimes don't make a whole lot of sense, and having patients have to travel to the institution, et cetera, to get checked or get blood drawn or whatever. And simply streamlining that process has been a huge win. So it's great to hear you comment on that, because I think this will set us up well going forward.
I think that a key point of this is that perhaps there's a silver lining as it relates to the ability for us to be able to ensure that these changes aren't just acute changes that we're making that are directed towards improving patient experience and accessibility for trials, but rather lasting changes that will have an opportunity to really make us more efficient going forward. I can say that at AstraZeneca, and it sounds like the same has absolutely happened at the Cleveland Clinic, that having new systems that allow all of our colleagues to have automated daily updates on the impact from COVID across every one of our internal clinical studies, that availability of the dynamic data sets that allow us to be able to ensure that we're quickly identifying when challenges present themselves, if protocols need to be amended with very slight amendments that don't need to go through long review, but just make sense. I think that the ability to cut through some of the bureaucracy that existed before and without in any way compromising on quality has been an important focus for us.
Yeah, I would really echo that. And I think that's a pretty big deal. So, I mean, one of the take-home points is that telemedicine has certainly been wonderful for standard of care and for routine care, is probably especially in primary care, but certainly in oncology as well. But additionally, telemedicine can leverage an ability to be more efficient with clinical trials, clinical research, and research in general. And so that's a pretty big win that I agree with you, I think is going to be sustaining. Before we leave kind of the COVID topic, I know AstraZeneca has a partnership with Oxford, and Oxford's one of the organizations making a vaccine. And the company also has a role in neutralizing antibodies for COVID. I don't know if you'd like to briefly comment on either of those.
Well, I think on this piece, my focus is predominantly, exclusively on the oncology business. I think that one of the things that at AstraZeneca, we in first quarter of this year really focused in on what are all of the different ways that we can be making a meaningful contribution to addressing the pandemic. And I think that certainly the Oxford vaccine, which is continuing to progress well, and I think that we're in phase 3 studies that are moving forward across the globe, and we're pleased to be able to continue that partnership with Oxford. Like you said, also there's a variety of treatments, whether it's through monoclonals that are directed at actually targeting the disease, or in fact other studies like the CLAVI study that we're running with our BTKI calquence that looks at acute respiratory disease for patients that have, really the severe symptoms associated with COVID. We really tried to look at how can we leverage the portfolio to address both vaccination as well as treatment. I think that the third piece, though, that for me, I've focused my energy on is maintaining continuity of care for cancer patients. And I think that this is something that we have doubled our efforts on. what became very clear in the immediate days following lockdown and the pandemic was that the questions that both physicians and patients had were no longer the ones pre-COVID. It was now, how do we safely administer an infused therapy in the context of COVID? What information do we have about comorbidities that might now be relevant? And we've really worked hard to pivot our efforts to ensure that all patients on an AstraZeneca medication were able to stay on an AstraZeneca medication. And I think that this has been a singular focus of our organization within the oncology division, and then allowing others that are in AstraZeneca focused on the vaccine and other treatments to direct their energies there.
So that's another very interesting topic. My second hat here at the clinic is that I'm Director of Physician Leadership and Leadership Development. So the COVID pandemic was certainly a test of leadership for anybody in a leadership role. What specifically did you do to ensure that the goals that you just articulated actually occurred?
Well, quite tactically, and I think you're asking an important execution question, is that we pulled together between Jose Baselga, who runs our R&D for oncology, and myself, rapidly what we called business continuity planning meetings. And the whole goal of those meetings was to get very, very clear on what our primary priorities were. And what we were able to very quickly determine was that priority one was that if there's an existing patient on a medicine, that we want to maintain that. And there's a lot of things that went along with that. You can imagine desire to move from twice monthly dosing to once monthly dosing on medicines like Imfinzi. Well, we accelerated the work that we were doing on that. The work that we did with guidelines groups in order to make sure that we were engaging with them on how we could rapidly provide medical information to allow for the updating of guidelines in dynamic time was something that we also organized and mobilized against. The second big bucket we focused in on was for new indications, for new label extensions. And this obviously presented a separate challenge, which is the educational requirement for the community. And remember, across the globe, we're no longer having the ability for face-to-face. And so we really pivoted very strongly towards leveraging technology and virtual means for providing that education. I think that pivot means that you are already working on it. One of the things I found, and it'd be interesting to see, Doctor, what your experience was, is you can't pivot to something you didn't already have in the works. So we were already working through virtual, we were already working through lots of ways of engaging digital. And so we were able to dial those up within the context that we were operating in. And I think that the third thing that I'd like to say is that the way we've engaged with stakeholders has also changed. And I think that's an important leadership dimension that you're highlighting. I mean, one of the efforts that I was really impressed by, I thought there was a great example, which ASCO launched immediately an emergency initiative called COVID Impacts Cancer. And they saw that there was a need to establish a registry for its members to share data on how the coronavirus is impacting patients and providers, and what's the information and resources that they need. And AstraZeneca was the first donor. We donated $1 million to fund this and get it started. And ASCO's now raised over $6 million for the project. And so that's an example of us reallocating the way that we want to engage with our key stakeholders and the key members of the community to address the dynamic changes in needs that emerged, and to move away from maybe some of the more traditional things that we would have focused in on. So having a leadership mindset of needing to stay dynamic and focus in on what's needed now, I think was really important.
For us, I think the most important thing was making sure everybody was safe. There was a huge amount of fear initially, and so I think there was a lot of components to that, which probably go beyond this conversation, but several of them are, I think I had to be present, and so I was, and I had to communicate excessively, pretty much daily, about what was going on, both within the clinic in Cleveland and Ohio, as well as worldwide. And and actually doing more than speaking. I mean, we had to create a safe physical environment, and we had to figure out how to interact with patients in a different way, as you alluded to. The good news is that the organization, I think, was brilliant in its approach to it, and there was a lot of reassurance from our CEO. And I think that ultimately, work is about relationships, and we're very proud of how engaged our employees were and what we were able to do. Um, so you have an awful lot of drugs in your pipeline, Dave. How do you allocate resources? How do you prioritize both during the pandemic and probably more importantly, going beyond the pandemic? Um, do you want to target the most common cancers? Do you see opportunities in more rare cancers? Kind of what's your philosophy?
Well, the philosophy that we have starts first with a belief that advances in the biology and scientific understanding together with technology have brought us to a spot where we do think that remission or long-term durable responses, or perhaps even in some situations, the possibility of cure is now possible. And we really have focused in on advancing medicines and advancing studies that we believe can drive the most step change improvement in outcomes. It's much less of a commercial exercise looking at size of opportunity, and instead taking a look at where do we think we can actually move the needle on outcomes. The two places that we have really begun to focus our efforts is on moving into early stage disease, where we believe, quite, I guess, obviously, that there's the greatest opportunity for improvement in patient outcomes. The practical realities of moving to early, though, mean that we've got to identify different endpoints, novel clinical trial design. Advancements in cell-free DNA are allowing us to be able to do that. I think it'll allow us to do that even more going forward. We're particularly proud of studies like Pacific, which moved checkpoint inhibition with Imfinzi or durvalumab into the stage 3 setting. That served as a proof of concept for us that you can move early. You can move early quickly and safely, but that we disrupted, I think, within ourselves internally, the idea that everything needed to start with late line metastatic disease and gradually make its way into earlier settings. I think the second big population that we continue to stay honed in on is resistant and refractory disease. While obviously that's more seen in the metastatic setting, the scientific understanding that we can develop by targeting resistance, addressing resistance, and then coupling that with a desire to move that up front. It's that combination of the precision medicine approach together with how we accelerate into earlier lines of therapy. That's predominantly where we focused a lot of our efforts on. And I think the last thing that I would highlight is that we do believe that multimodality treatment is necessary in order to drive the outcomes that we're looking for. And I think that this means multiple modalities in terms of obviously surgery, radiation, medical oncology, and the work that we're doing with multidisciplinary teams, the work that we're doing to move beyond what I would say was, a decade ago of a focus predominantly on medical oncology to a holistic treatment plan really also guides the way that we make our decisions.
So the other thing that's pretty clear these days is we tend to bucket things into, genomic therapy is here and immunological therapy is here, and I think increasingly we know that there's interplay between the two, and the microbiome comes into play, and that influences response rates of immunological drugs, et cetera. So when you talk about multidisciplinary, it's not just from a clinical, surgery, radiation therapy, medical oncology, et cetera. It's also within the science. And what's your approach to that?
Well, I think that within this dimension as well, we have worked hard to, within our discovery portion of our business, really go out and attract what we believe is some of the best talent to be leading and partnering together with institutions like Cleveland Clinic on advancing that science. I think that we know that if we aren't leading antibody drug conjugate, tumor drivers, DDR, IO discovery science, that we won't be able to get ourselves to where we need to be when it just comes to late stage development. And really, it does come down fundamentally to ensuring that we have the right people, that we give the ability to follow the science as opposed to having them chase after commercial opportunities. I think that is the most fundamental area of focus, is ensuring that we have a well-funded, robust, with top talent discovery science group. And that's something that we've really been putting a lot of effort in building on top of what already existed at AstraZeneca. But I think that we've really taken it leaps and bounds over the last couple of years.
Cancer screening, is, some people say, is the lowest hanging fruit there is to try to improve outcomes. And there's a lot of things that go into cancer screenings, but one of the challenges historically is that there's only a handful of diseases that standard screening exists. There's breast cancer, there's cervical cancer, there's colon cancer. Increasingly, the potential role of liquid biopsies for detection of metastatic disease, but also potentially as a screening tool, exists. Is your program involved in any sort of screening activities?
So screening and early detection and diagnosis is absolutely an area that we have put a lot more time, energy, and effort into as the programs that we have moved into earlier stages of disease. I think also I certainly learned from my days working at Genentech, Roche, and the value of having treatments in the HER2 positive metastatic breast cancer setting and early led to increased impetus and reason for screening to take place. I think studies like the ADAURA study with osimertinib that we're looking forward to having those phase 3 results translate into approvals gives greater rise now for us to be able to put a lot more emphasis on screening and diagnosis. We're doing work together with the IASLC on how we take a look at a global improvement on screening. And I think this is an important piece, that improving screening takes multiple dimensions. In some parts of the globe, we still need to rely on CT scans. In other parts of the globe, I'm hopeful that technologies like the GRAIL technology will improve and allow us to be able to do screening across multiple cancer types in a way that will allow us to have earlier interventions. And then the third dimension, which has actually been something that I've been pleasantly surprised by through COVID-19, or incidental nodules. I think one of the things that's been, again, kind of a silver lining is that the number of chest scans that are available now as a result of the pandemic across the globe are much, much higher. There's work that we've been doing in partnership with various scientific communities. Specifically, we've got an effort that's underway within Russia, where we're working together with the Moscow Center of Diagnostic and Telemedicine, which is also known as Moscow Radiology, via artificial intelligence to determine signs and symptoms of lung cancer in patients that have screens or scans that are available that we can now look at. And I think that there's a lot of opportunities, and we've mobilized across the globe to really have those on the ground, specific to a geography, opportunities to drive on all three of those dimensions. And I think that the impetus is now here as we see more and more trials giving us hope that we can, in fact, deliver better outcomes for those patients if they are, in fact, screened.
Yeah, I would agree with that in a big way. I think there's a huge opportunity for looking at incidental lung nodules. And actually, our efforts were just published this week in New England Journal of Medicine Catalyst. Peter Mazzone leads that effort here, and there's a lot of really cool stuff that you can do to try to reduce mortality associated with these things.
I think also, Doctor, this one of the things that's pretty important here is that you take a look at something like incidental nodules. You have to have patients taking an active role in coming to the clinic and coming to hospitals in order for that to be a viable option. And I think it comes back to where we started. And maybe I'd like to talk about one of the things that we're doing at AstraZeneca that I think is quite important, which is we started on the importance of ensuring that patients are active and that they are coming to the clinic when they see that they have signs or symptoms or reason, or just even regular checkups. So we've partnered with global patient coalitions representing over 650 patient groups, more than 14 million patients, to put together a campaign and a platform that is, how do we get patients to re-engage? How do we make sure that there's an understanding that where care or where just normal visits to the physician have been interrupted, that we need to make sure that we regenerate that. We have a campaign called New Normal, Same Cancer, and we're going to be rolling it out this month. And it's urging cancer patients to return to cancer services following the disruption to care due to COVID-19. And it's a simple message. It's about, don't wait, contact your doctor, get checked. We're rolling this out globally together with the partners that we've just spoken to. And I think that we're really calling on all global healthcare leaders and policymakers to ensure that low COVID risk pathways are available for patients to seek screening and care, because this is the key, because the cancer will not slow down and we can't let the pandemic get in the way.
I couldn't agree with you more. So certainly applaud the effort and thank you for that, because we're doing the same thing, obviously, here in the trenches and trying to reach out directly to our patient population. You spent a few years as leading the oncology effort in Japan. Is there anything different about cancer in Japan that you think the audience might be interested in hearing about?
Well, certainly the incidence and prevalence of some cancer types in Japan is higher and more prevalent in Japan, which is well understood by your audience for sure. But I think that the implication of that, and in particular, the time that I spent in Japan was during the launch into the commercial context, or into the real world setting of Tagrisso, but also in bringing Lynparza to Japan. And I think one of the things that is done quite well within the Japanese healthcare system is a deep appreciation and understanding for the role of biomarkers, and a very well organized healthcare system in terms of ensuring that testing is done and making sure that there's very good multidisciplinary team engagement and interaction to be able to make sure kind of at the front end of the process that it's well organized so that the appropriate treatments can be put into place. And I think, just like you hear in many industries, the execution and the focus on precision within Japan carries through into the healthcare industry. And I think that just that laser focus on making sure that there's a dedication to the precision medicine and the willingness to do everything necessary to have testing take place is something that has been really something I took away from Japan, and I clearly learned from, and I think that it's very applicable across the globe.
So we're in the middle of a presidential campaign, and one of the things that comes up when the issues are discussed is the cost of prescription drugs. And certainly in oncology, that's not a trivial issue for many. What is your thought about that, and what's AstraZeneca's approach to that?
Well, our number one focus has always been on first, access to medicines, and secondly, patient affordability. And I think that is always been our North Star, and that if we can make sure that we've got global access to new therapies, and the way in which we take a look at all of our clinical development plans is that they are global in their scope and in their nature. We want to make sure that we're able to bring therapies to Europe, China, Japan, US, rest of world as quickly as possible and with as little lag as exists. And we do put an awful lot of effort and energy, especially in the United States, into ensuring that patient affordability is something that is a core focus area of ours. And I think that this is a spot where the efforts that we make to really understand for patients what the copay implications are and how we can really work for ways to ensure that we're supporting patients in every way that we can and that is appropriate to make sure that their medicines are affordable and that they've got good access to them.
So I don't think in 2010 anybody could have forecasted where we are in 2020 with respect to oncology and science around oncology and cancer. It's been a remarkable decade. If you try to look 10 years forward or even 5 years forward, where do you think we'll be?
I would love to see in the future, whether it's 5 or 10 years, that we are having early interventions with patients where we're catching disease before it becomes stage 4, and where we are able to direct therapy based upon both enhanced understanding of precision medicine, but also because we've run trials that have allowed us to be able to demonstrate the safety and efficacy in earlier settings, that we will be able to intervene early and have benefits to those patients. I think there's a couple of things that are going to happen for us to get there. I think one of them is that just the cost of that early intervention is going to have to be something that is scalable, right? We need to have the early intervention technology be such that it can actually be deployed at scale. And I think that there's a lot of reason for optimism that that's going to happen. I think the second place, though, and I think that this is something that's relevant for all of us working together, is that payers and guidelines committees and those that are evaluating studies have gotten quite accustomed to endpoints that are based upon metastatic disease. And I think that we need to evolve how we evaluate the benefit of medicines, because society, I think, will value cure. Society will value remissions and durable responses. But we may not have the ability to always drive to these traditional endpoints like median overall survival if we have an early intervention. So we really need to make sure that the work we're doing together between the investigator community and industry and policymakers is paving the way for these early studies to be able to quickly get to patients, and for there to be an opportunity for us to get them approved and of course reimbursed, because without those sets of components, we don't deliver them in the real world. So I think there's a lot of work that we need to do to now make sure that the real world delivery catches up with where I think that the science is taking us.
Another great point, and I would echo that. I think, one of the other things is, I don't think that 15 years ago there were very many cancers that you could turn into a chronic disease. I think you either did really well with them or they tended to do very bad things to people. But increasingly, especially with some of the pretty cool immunological therapies that we have, people are living with their cancers in a way that they are fully functional and have productive lives, but they're still patients. And so the whole issue of survivorship and what does that mean short-term, long-term, and really a growing number, logarithmically increasing actually number of survivors, is another thing that I think we'll certainly see play out in the next decade. And I'm not sure we do a good enough job figuring out how to manage that optimally.
I think that, to use your example of 10 years ago in lung cancer, the notion of a survivorship program for lung cancer didn't even make it onto the radar screen because there was debate over which platinum-based doublet was best for patients. Right. And we look at where we've advanced to now, and we've got a series of, whether it's IO-directed therapies or therapies like osimertinib or antibody drug conjugates, that are allowing us to actually say early intervention may not only be possible, but we can see is driving improvement. We're bending survival curves in lung cancer, and I think that that's only going to stand to improve. But you're right, that then allows us to expand the scope to say, well, we are not just thinking about treatments for stage 4. We now need to be thinking about everything from early intervention through to survivorship and everything that sits in between. And that's only done through partnerships and discussions like the ones that we're having today.
Dave, I want to thank you so much for this. It's been certainly my pleasure. Learned a lot. I hope the audience has learned a lot too. Any closing comments?
Well, Dr. Bolwell, I just want to say I am very, very appreciative of the opportunity to spend the time with you here today. I think that I guess I will end on a note of optimism, which is that I do think that the declines that we've seen in cancer screenings and diagnoses, I hope the nadir is behind us. I'm encouraged to hear that at the Cleveland Clinic, you're seeing return back to levels that are on the right path towards where we need to go. And I am confident that the research and development efforts that we've certainly been making at AstraZeneca and that I know the investor community is making are going to ensure that we also are delivering the best possible therapies that we can as soon as possible. And I think that partnership and collaboration is something that has allowed us to be able to make the progress that we have during 2020. We're not out of the woods yet, but continued partnership and deepening of those, I think, is the path forward.
I agree with you, Dave. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.